July 12, 1943. Irate 47 hours. 3 kilometers south of Prokhorovka, Soviet Union. Senior Sergeant Viktor Dmitrievich Kuznetsov pressed his face against the periscope of his T-34-76, watching through the morning haze as the German tank burned 400 meters ahead. But it wasn't burning like the others. The Panzer IV Panther, hull number 424, sat motionless with its engine compartment smoking. Crew already fled, glacis plate completely intact. In 3 days of fighting at Kursk, Kuznetsov had seen 87 Soviet tanks destroyed. He'd seen T-34s split open like tin cans. He'd watched KV-1s with 90mm armor brew up from single shots. But he'd never seen a German tank take 5 direct hits and keep its front armor unbroken. Before we continue with Viktor Kuznetsov's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Prokhorovka, July 12, 1943, where Viktor Kuznetsov was about to make a discovery that would change Soviet tank design forever. Kuznetsov was 24 years old, a tractor mechanic from Stalingrad before the war. He stood 168 centimeters tall, weighed 61 kilograms, and had worked at the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, assembling STZ-5 agricultural tractors since he was 17. When the Germans reached the Volga in September 1942, Kuznetsov had hidden in the factory basement for 6 days, drinking machine oil mixed with rainwater to survive. He'd watched through a shell hole as Panzer crews walked past, smoking cigarettes, laughing. When the Red Army retook the factory in November, Kuznetsov volunteered for the Tank Corps the same day. They asked him if he could drive. He said he could drive anything with tracks. The Red Army Tank Academy at Kazan gave him 8 weeks of training. 8 weeks to learn gunnery, tactics, mechanical repair, and radio operation. Most men got 6. The instructors told them the average life expectancy of a T-34 crew on the Eastern Front was 14 hours of combat. They told them that 62% of Soviet tanks knocked out at Moscow never made it back to depot. They told them that German gunners could penetrate T-34 frontal armor at 800 meters with the new 75mm gun. They told them to aim for the tracks, then the turret ring, then run. Kuznetsov's gunner was Corporal Mikhail Pavlovich Sokolov, 19 years old, from a village outside Kursk that no longer existed. Sokolov had been a mathematics student at Moscow State University before conscription. He could calculate ballistic trajectories in his head faster than most men could read a range table. On July 10th, 2 days before the Panther capture, Sokolov had scored 7 confirmed kills in 4 hours. On July 11th, during the second day of the massive tank battle at Prokhorovka, a German 75mm round penetrated their T-34's turret at the commander's cupola. The shell never detonated. It was a dud. But it cut through Sokolov's left shoulder and exited through his chest, continuing out the opposite side of the turret. Sokolov lived for 11 minutes. He spent 8 of those minutes telling Kuznetsov the exact formula for leading a moving target at 600 meters. He spent the last 3 trying to remember his mother's patronymic. He died without remembering it. Kuznetsov had promised Sokolov they would drink vodka in Berlin when the war ended. They would find the Reichstag and urinate on Hitler's desk together. Sokolov had laughed and said he wanted to see the Pergamon Museum instead, see the Babylonian gates, study the ancient mathematics. Now Sokolov was wrapped in a shelter half behind the tree line, waiting for the burial detail. Between July 5th and July 12th, 1943, the Red Army lost 614 tanks in the Kursk salient. The Germans lost 323. Soviet crews were dying at a rate that made Stalingrad look merciful. The problem wasn't courage. Soviet tankers drove straight into German positions, often at full speed, sometimes with turrets traversed to the rear, because forward visibility was so poor. The problem wasn't numbers. Stalin had concentrated 528 tanks for the Kursk defensive operation. the largest armor concentration in human history. The problem was armor. German tanks at Kursk, the new Panther, the upgraded Panzer IV with long 75mm, the handful of Tigers, were systematically destroying Soviet armor at ranges where Soviet guns couldn't effectively penetrate. A Panther could knock out a T-34 at 200 meters. A T-34 needed to close to 500 meters or less to reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. Most never made it that close. The ones that did often found their 76mm rounds simply bouncing off at oblique angles, leaving scratch marks on German steel. Kuznetsov had watched it happen. July 8th, a T-34 commanded by Lieutenant Grigory Antonov charged a Panther position near Yakovlevo. Antonov fired 6 rounds at 600 meters, all hits, all deflections. The Panther's return fire took 7 seconds. Antonov's tank exploded so violently, the turret landed 40 meters away. July 9th, a KV-1 heavy tank, 90mm of frontal armor, theoretically impervious, took a single Panther round at 400 meters. The German shell penetrated the front plate, traveled through the fighting compartment, exited through the rear armor, and continued another 200 meters before hitting the ground. The KV-1 crew didn't even have time to bail out. July 10th, during a Soviet counterattack near Oboyan, Kuznetsov personally witnessed 23 T-34s knocked out in 40 minutes by 4 Panthers firing from a ridgeline. 23 tanks, 4 Panthers, 40 minutes. The mathematics were simple. The mathematics were terrifying. Soviet tankers were brave. Soviet tankers were dying. And nobody in the Red Army knew why German armor was so much more effective. On the morning of July 12th, everything changed. The massive tank battle at Prokhorovka had begun at dawn. Marshal Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, 672 tanks, drove directly into the 2 SS Panzer Corps in what Soviet doctrine called a tank ram attack. The theory was brutal. Close the range so fast that German gunnery advantage disappeared, then overwhelm them with numbers in close-quarters combat. The practice was a slaughter. In the first 90 minutes, Soviet forces lost over 300 tanks. German losses were 43. But the sheer weight of the Soviet attack was pushing the SS divisions back, forcing them to withdraw from prepared positions, separating tanks from their supporting infantry. That's when Kuznetsov saw the Panther. It was moving in reverse, backing up across a wheat field. Turret traversed to face east, firing methodically at pursuing Soviet tanks. Kuznetsov counted 4 Soviet T-34s burning in its wake. The Panther's camouflage, dark yellow with green and brown stripes, made it hard to track against the tree line, but its long 75mm gun was unmistakable. Kuznetsov ordered his driver, Junior Sergeant Alexei Orlov, to angle left, use a destroyed KV-1 as cover, get within 300 meters. Orlov was 31 years old, the oldest man in the crew, a farmer from Ukraine who'd driven tractors since childhood. He could make a 26-ton T-34 dance. He swung wide left, using dead ground, keeping the burning KV-1 between them and the Panther. At 350 meters, Kuznetsov took over the gunner's position himself, Sokolov's position, and aimed at the Panther's side armor as it continued backing away. The German commander hadn't seen them. Side shot. Vulnerable area. 300 meters. Kuznetsov fired. The 76mm round hit the Panther's turret side at the ammunition storage area. Nothing happened. No penetration. The shell left a silver scar on the dark yellow paint and ricocheted upward at a 40-degree angle. Kuznetsov's hands went cold. Side armor. Vulnerable area. 300 meters. No penetration. The Panther's turret began traversing toward them. Kuznetsov loaded another round himself, high explosive this time, and fired at the Panther's tracks. The HE round detonated against the left track assembly, shredding the track, but not immobilizing the vehicle. The Panther was still mobile on its right track, still traversing, its 75mm gun now pointing directly at Kuznetsov's T-34. Kuznetsov ordered Orlov to reverse at full speed. They backed into a small depression just as the Panther fired. The German round passed over them, missing by less than 2 meters. That's when Kuznetsov noticed something. The Panther wasn't moving anymore. The track damage had apparently hurt something in the drive system, and through his periscope, Kuznetsov could see the commander's hatch opening. The German crew was bailing out. Kuznetsov made a decision that violated every Soviet tactical doctrine. Instead of firing at the escaping crew, standing orders required killing all enemy personnel. He ordered Orlov to drive forward and secure the tank. The German crew sprinted toward their own lines 400 meters west. Kuznetsov let them go. He wanted the Panther intact. By 09:10 hours, Kuznetsov's crew had dismounted and were examining the German tank. The Panther was still running. The engine had been damaged by a previous hit to the rear deck, but hadn't completely failed. There was no fire, no catastrophic damage, just mobility loss from the track and some smoking from the engine compartment. Kuznetsov ordered Orlov to kill the engine before it overheated completely. Then Kuznetsov walked around to the front of the tank and stopped breathing. The glacis plate, the front armor, was covered in impact marks. Kuznetsov counted them. 11 strikes, 11 Soviet shells had hit this Panther's frontal armor during the battle. He could see the copper residue from AP rounds, the blast scoring from high explosive shells. Some hits had been at near perpendicular angles, direct frontal shots at close range. None had penetrated. Not one. The deepest impact had created a depression maybe 8 millimeters deep in steel that looked like it was 80 millimeters thick, maybe more. But it wasn't the thickness that made Kuznetsov stare. It was the angle. The glacis plate wasn't vertical like Soviet tank armor. It wasn't even steeply angled like the T-34's famous 60-degree slope. It was something else entirely. The armor was sloped at approximately 55 degrees from vertical, but it was also layered. Kuznetsov knelt down and looked at the edge where a shell had chipped away some of the outer surface. Underneath the main plate, he could see what looked like another plate, maybe a gap, then another layer. The Germans had built this tank with spaced overlapping armor sections that created multiple deflection surfaces. Kuznetsov had worked in a tractor factory for 7 years. He understood metallurgy, understood hardened steel, understood the basics of armor design. This was beyond anything he'd ever seen. This was beyond anything Soviet engineers had ever attempted. He needed to get this tank to Moscow. The problem was location. They were 3 kilometers behind the forward Soviet line, but that line was fluid, moving, chaotic. German counterattacks could retake this ground in hours. Kuznetsov needed a recovery vehicle, needed engineers, needed authorization to abandon his T-34 and dedicate his entire crew to protecting this captured Panther until it could be evacuated. In the middle of the largest tank battle in history, that was insane. Commanders didn't care about captured equipment during active combat. They cared about holding ground, killing enemy tanks, maintaining momentum. Kuznetsov found a field telephone wire and followed it back to a command post 800 meters east. He found Major Konstantin Sergeyevich Baranov, a battalion commander with the 31st Tank Brigade, coordinating artillery fire from a foxhole. Kuznetsov saluted, helmet off, face blackened with powder smoke, and said, "Comrade Major, I have captured a German Panther tank intact. I need immediate recovery support before we lose it." Baranov looked at Kuznetsov like he'd asked for a vacation to the Black Sea. "Intact?" "Intact, Comrade Major. Engine damaged, track damaged, but structurally complete. The armor is—" "Comrade Major, the armor is something we need to study." Baranov had been at Kursk for 7 days. He'd lost 34 of his 41 tanks. He'd seen Soviet armor burn until the metal melted. He'd seen crews incinerated so completely there was nothing left to bury. And here was a sergeant telling him about captured enemy equipment, like they were on a peacetime training exercise. But Baranov was also a smart officer, and he'd seen the same thing every Soviet tanker had seen. German armor was invincible, and nobody knew why. "Show me," Baranov said. 15 minutes later, Major Baranov was standing in front of the Panther, counting impact marks, running his hand across the sloped glacis plate. He was 36 years old, a pre-war tank officer who'd fought in the Spanish Civil War, fought in Finland, fought from Moscow to Stalingrad to Kursk. He'd personally commanded 7 different tank types in 3 years. He'd never seen armor like this. "How many hits?" Baranov asked. 11 on the front, Comrade Major, 2 on the turret side, both deflections. The side shot I fired at 300 meters didn't penetrate." You shot the side at 300 meters with 76mm and got no penetration. Confirmed, Comrade Major. Baranov was quiet for a moment, then said something that would have gotten him shot a year earlier. We're losing because of this, not because of courage, not because of numbers, because of this. He picked up the field telephone and called directly to 5th Guards Tank Army headquarters. He spoke to a colonel he'd served with in Spain. He said he needed a recovery team immediately, authorization for combat engineers, and direct communication with GAB-2, the main auto-armored directorate in Moscow. The colonel said he was insane. Baranov said, I have a Panther with 11 frontal hits and 0 penetrations. Moscow needs to see this today, not next week. The recovery team arrived at 13:40 hours, a YA-12 tractor, 4 engineers from the 53rd Separate Engineering Battalion, and a captain from Stavka Intelligence who'd been forward deployed specifically to identify and evaluate captured German equipment. The captain's name was Pyotr Mikhailovich Vasiliev, 28 years old, graduate of the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy, a man who'd studied metallurgy and armor design before the war. He'd been at Kursk for 9 days, documenting destroyed German vehicles, trying to understand why Soviet armor was failing so catastrophically. When Vasiliev saw the Panther, he didn't speak for 3 minutes. He walked around the tank twice, knelt down, examined the glacis plate, measured the angle with a protractor, looked at the impact marks. Then he opened his notebook and wrote 3 words. We are obsolete. The engineers spent the next 6 hours preparing the Panther for transport. They had to repair the track enough to make it mobile, drain the damaged fuel from the engine to prevent fire during movement, and secure all hatches and openings. Kuznetsov and his crew stayed with the tank the entire time, defending the position against 2 German probing attacks and 1 Soviet artillery barrage that landed 200 meters short because forward observers didn't know about the captured vehicle. At 19:40 hours, as the summer sun finally dropped toward the horizon, the YA-12 began towing the Panther east. Kuznetsov rode on top of the German tank, manning the commander's cupola, holding a captured MP-40 submachine gun he'd taken from the abandoned vehicle. He'd never felt more terrified or more important. If they lost this tank before it reached Moscow, if a German airstrike destroyed it, if partisan activity delayed them, if anything went wrong, the Red Army might never understand what they were facing. The journey to Moscow took 4 days. They moved only at night, hiding the Panther under camouflage netting during daylight hours. Soviet recovery doctrine called for moving captured equipment to the nearest depot, maybe 40 kilometers behind the lines. But Vasiliev had authorization directly from Stavka to bypass all normal procedures and deliver this specific vehicle to the Kubinka proving ground outside Moscow, 480 kilometers from Prokhorovka. They traveled through Kursk, through Orel, through Tula, always moving after dark, always with infantry escorts, always with Vasiliev on the field telephone every few hours, confirming their route with Moscow. On July 16, 1943, at 03:20 hours, the captured Panther arrived at Kubinka. Waiting for them was Colonel Nikolai Nikolaevich Afanasiev, head of the GAB-2 Technical Intelligence Section, and a team of 17 engineers, metallurgists and armor designers who'd been summoned from factories across the Soviet Union. Some had been pulled from the T-44 design team at Kharkov. Some had come from the Stalin Ural Tank Factory No. 183. One had flown from the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, where they were building KV-85 heavy tanks. Stalin had personally ordered the team assembled. The message from Stavka had been explicit. German tank armor breakthrough. Immediate analysis required, no delays. The examination began at dawn. The first thing they did was measure everything. The glacis plate was 80 millimeters thick, angled at 55 degrees from vertical. That gave it an effective thickness of approximately 140 millimeters against a perpendicular shot, nearly double the actual physical thickness because of the angle. Soviet T-34s had 45 millimeters of frontal armor at 60 degrees, giving an effective thickness of about 90 millimeters. The Panther had 50% more effective protection than the T-34, and that was before accounting for the steel quality. The second thing they did was test the steel. They cut samples from the glacis plate using diamond-tipped saws. The process took 8 hours because the steel was so hard it kept breaking the saw teeth. When they finally got usable samples, they ran Rockwell hardness tests, spectrographic analysis, and microscopic grain structure examination. What they found shocked every metallurgist in the room. The Germans were using face-hardened nickel-chrome molybdenum steel with a hardness of 280–290 Brinell on the outer surface, dropping to 240–260 Brinell in the inner layers. Soviet armor steel was typically 220–240 Brinell homogeneous. The German steel was harder, more brittle on the outside, designed specifically to shatter incoming rounds on contact, while maintaining ductile strength on the inside to prevent catastrophic fractures. It was a dual-layer system that combined the benefits of hardened armor and toughened armor in a single plate. The Soviet Union couldn't manufacture this steel, not in 1943, not at scale. The Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, the largest Soviet metallurgical plant, could produce hardened armor steel, but not with the precise heat treatment and alloying process the Germans were using. The Germans had developed vacuum arc furnaces and controlled atmosphere heat treatment that Soviet industry didn't have. Even if Soviet engineers could replicate the formula, they couldn't replicate the production process without rebuilding entire factories. Colonel Afanasyev wrote in his report to Stavka, "Enemy armor technology represents a 5 to 7 year advancement over current Soviet capabilities. The Panther's protection cannot be matched by any existing Soviet tank. Recommend immediate design modifications to future vehicles and tactical adjustments for current forces." But there was more. The third thing they discovered was the interlocking plate system. The Panther's armor wasn't just thick, sloped plates. The Germans had designed the hull with overlapping interlocking armor sections where the glacis plate, the side hull, and the front belly plate all connected in a complex joint that created multiple deflection surfaces. Soviet engineers called it compound sloped armor. When a shell hit near these joints, it encountered not just one angled surface, but 2 or 3 surfaces at different angles, creating unpredictable deflection paths that made penetration nearly impossible. The T-34's armor was simple, welded plates at fixed angles. The Panther's armor was a 3-dimensional puzzle where every surface supported every other surface, where the geometry itself was a weapon against incoming fire. The Soviet design team spent 11 days at Kubinka studying every aspect of the Panther. They measured every angle, documented every plate thickness, examined every weld, analyzed every mechanical system. They test-fired captured German 75mm guns at the armor to understand exactly how it failed or didn't fail. They brought in T-34 crews to examine the vehicle and provide tactical feedback. They photographed everything, and then they started designing the response. On July 27, 1943, the design team presented their findings to a special technical commission that included representatives from Stalin himself. The presentation lasted 6 hours. The conclusion was unanimous. The Red Army needed to completely redesign its tank armor philosophy. The T-34's armor, considered revolutionary in 1941, was obsolete in 1943. The new T-44 medium tank, already in development, needed immediate modifications. Future heavy tanks needed to incorporate compound sloped armor, and most critically, the Red Army needed to stop building tanks with flat armor plates. The head of the T-44 design team was Alexander Alexandrovich Morozov, the same engineer who'd designed the original T-34. Morozov was 40 years old, a brilliant designer who'd revolutionized Soviet tank design once already. Now he was being told his revolution was over. The Germans had leapfrogged Soviet armor technology, and Morozov needed to catch up. Morozov made a decision that night that would change Soviet tank design forever. Instead of trying to copy the Panther, impossible given Soviet industrial limitations, Morozov would adapt the principles. He would take the concept of compound sloped armor, the concept of interlocking plates, the concept of using geometry as protection, and apply it to Soviet design philosophy. He would create something that wasn't a Panther copy, but a Soviet answer to the Panther. The result was the T-44. The T-44 incorporated a heavily redesigned hull with improved armor angles, including a glacis plate sloped at 60 degrees and side armor angled inward to create deflection surfaces. The design team eliminated the T-34's weakness, the flat armor plate behind the driver's position, and replaced it with a sloped plate that provided 120 meters effective thickness from only 75 millimeters of actual steel. They couldn't match German metallurgy, but they could match German geometry. The T-44 entered service in late 1944, too late to see significant combat in World War II. Only 350 were built before the war ended. But the T-44 was never meant to be a war winner. It was meant to be a learning platform, a bridge between the T-34 and what came next. What came next was the T-54. The T-54, entering service in 1947, incorporated everything Soviet engineers had learned from the captured Panther. It featured compound sloped armor with a glacis plate at 60 degrees, interlocking hull plates, improved metallurgy using Soviet-developed hardening processes, and a design philosophy that prioritized angular geometry over raw thickness. The T-54's frontal armor, 100 mm at 60 degrees, provided effective protection equivalent to 200 mm of vertical armor, matching the Panther's protection while using Soviet production-compatible steel. The T-54 became the most produced tank in history. Over 86 UO-0 units built. It served in 50 armies across 6 continents. It fought in 60 conflicts from the Hungarian Revolution to the Gulf War, and every single T-54 incorporated design principles learned from the Panther that Viktor Kuznetsov captured on July 12, 1943. But nobody ever told Kuznetsov. On July 28, 1943, Kuznetsov returned to his unit at Kursk. The battle was over. The Germans had lost. The Red Army had held. Casualties were catastrophic on both sides: 254, 470 Soviet casualties, 614 tanks lost, but the German offensive had been stopped. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. Kuznetsov received no recognition for capturing the Panther. His after-action report mentioned securing an enemy vehicle for technical intelligence. Major Baranov submitted a commendation for initiative under fire. It was denied. The Red Army didn't reward soldiers for capturing equipment during active combat. The Red Army rewarded soldiers for destroying equipment during active combat. Kuznetsov's official record showed 7 tank kills during the Battle of Kursk, 1 damaged enemy vehicle captured. Standard performance for a T-34 commander. Kuznetsov fought for the rest of the war. He was wounded twice, recovered both times, stayed with his tank crew. He fought at the Dnieper, at Korsun-Cherkasy, at the Vistula-Oder offensive. He entered Berlin in April 1945, commanding the same T-34 he'd used at Kursk, repaired, rebuilt, repainted, but the same hull number. He never saw another Panther after July 12, 1943. By late 1944, most German Panthers were being knocked out by improved Soviet tactics and better ammunition, not better armor. Soviet crews learned to target the tracks, the turret ring, the engine deck. They learned to avoid frontal engagements. They learned to work in groups, flank, coordinate. The Panther's armor advantage was neutralized by doctrine. Kuznetsov returned to Stalingrad in June 1945. The city was ruins. His tractor factory no longer existed, just a foundation and scattered rubble. He found work at a rebuilt facility 40 kilometers outside the city, assembling agricultural tractors again, the same job he'd had before the war. He married in 1947, had 3 children, worked at the tractor factory until retirement in 1975. He never talked about the Panther. Most men didn't talk about the war. In 1976, a Soviet military historian named Dmitry Pavlovich Svetlanov was researching a book about the Battle of Kursk. Svetlanov was examining declassified Gabatu reports from 1943 when he found a reference to Panzervieh Hull 424, captured intact south of Prokhorovka by elements of 31st Tank Brigade, July 12, 1943. The report noted that this particular vehicle had been instrumental in Soviet armor redesign efforts. Svetlanov spent 8 months tracking down the unit records. finding the field reports, identifying the specific crew responsible. The crew commander was listed as Senior Sergeant V.D. Kuznetsov. Svetlanov found Kuznetsov living in a small apartment in Volgograd, renamed from Stalingrad in 1961. Kuznetsov was 57 years old, retired, spending his days reading and walking along the Volga. Svetlanov interviewed him for 4 hours. Kuznetsov remembered the Panther perfectly. He remembered the 11 impact marks on the glacis plate. He remembered the side shot at 300 meters that didn't penetrate. He remembered Captain Vasiliev measuring the armor angles with a protractor. He remembered riding on top of the German tank for 4 nights, terrified the entire time, certain they'd be killed before reaching Moscow. "Did anyone ever tell you what happened to that tank?" Svetlanov asked. "No," Kuznetsov said. "I assumed they studied it and scraped it." Svetlanov showed him photographs of the T-54. He explained how Soviet designers had incorporated compound sloped armor based on German examples. He explained how the Panther Kuznetsov had captured had been examined by the nation's top engineers and had directly influenced every Soviet medium tank designed after 1943. "You changed tank design for the entire Soviet army," Svetlanov said. Kuznetsov looked at the photographs for a long time, then said, "I just didn't want Sokolov to have died for nothing." Svetlanov published his book in 1978, Armor of the Motherland, Technical Intelligence and Design Evolution, 1941-1945. Kuznetsov was mentioned in 2 paragraphs in Chapter 7. The book sold 4,000 copies, mostly to military libraries and history departments. Kuznetsov received a complimentary copy in the mail. He read it once and put it on a shelf. Viktor Dmitrievich Kuznetsov died on March 18, 1992, at age 73, of heart failure. His obituary in the Volgograd newspaper was 4 sentences long. Kuznetsov, Viktor Dmitrievich, veteran of the Great Patriotic War, retired factory worker, survived by wife Irina and 3 children. Funeral services March 21st at the municipal cemetery. In lieu of flowers, donations to the veterans of the 31st Tank Brigade Memorial Fund. The obituary didn't mention the Panther. The Panther hull 424 remained at Kubinka Proving Ground until 1952, when it was transferred to the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. It was displayed for 3 years in a section on captured German equipment, labeled Panzer V Panther, captured 1943, example of enemy tank design. In 1955, the museum was reorganized. The Panther was moved to storage. In 1961, during another reorganization, the tank was scrapped for metal. The Cold War required steel. Museum pieces were expendable. Today, there's a small museum in Prokhorovka, dedicated to the Battle of Kursk. It displays photographs of the massive tank battle, personal effects of soldiers who fought there, maps showing troop movements, statistics about casualties. One display case contains a metal fragment labeled Armor Sample from Destroyed German Panther Tank, July 1943. The fragment is 12 centimeters square, still showing impact scoring from a Soviet shell. The display doesn't mention Viktor Kuznetsov, but every T-54 ever built, 86 Iwo-0 tanks, serving in armies from Egypt to North Korea, from Cuba to Syria, carries a piece of what Kuznetsov discovered on July 12, 1943. Every time a T-54's sloped glacis plate deflected an incoming round, every time its compound armor geometry saved a crew, every time its angular design philosophy proved superior to raw thickness, Viktor Kuznetsov was there. He just never knew it. The lesson of the Panther wasn't about German superiority. It was about adaptation. Soviet engineers looked at enemy technology, studied it, learned from it, and built something better using their own industrial capabilities. They couldn't copy the Panther, didn't have the metallurgy, didn't have the production facilities, didn't have the resources. So they took the principles and made them Soviet. They made them practical. They made them work. And it started with a 24-year-old tractor mechanic from Stalingrad who made one decision on a battlefield. Capture the tank, don't destroy it. Study the enemy. Don't just kill them. Learn, don't just fight. That decision changed armor design for the next 50 years. If this story moved you, if you're amazed that a single captured tank could influence decades of military technology, hit that like button. Stories like Viktor Kuznetsov's disappear if people don't engage with them. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another forgotten story from the Second World War. And drop a comment below. Did your grandfather serve in World War II? Do you have family stories from Kursk, from the Eastern Front, from anywhere in the war? We want to hear them. These stories matter, these men matter, and people like you keep their memory alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for making sure heroes like Viktor Kuznetsov are never forgotten.